A no good, very bad day. I'm not going to redo everything we talked about last week, but of course, when we look at Job's circumstances, all in the course of a day, mind you, here, what we just read, there's no question that Job's day was worse than probably any day we can ever imagine. And I think that's done for a particular reason, because we all can say we've had bad days. We've all had days when nothing seems to go right. When from the time we wake up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night, it just seems like everything's against us. But none of us can ever get to the place, I think, where we can say, I've had it as bad as Job has had it. And so there's a lesson there to be learned from that. And so we're going to look at this morning from the perspective of how do we handle these bad days? And how do we make sense of these types of circumstances when we get put in trials, when we get put into difficult times? And so I want us to look at this morning in that regard. We looked last week at the question of Satan's access to Job. And we took a few little thoughts about this, which I'm not going to review entirely, except to say this. There's a couple of important principles that we must remember, no matter how bad our days get, no matter how bad our circumstances may seem, no matter how hot the fire of our trials may be upon us, we need to recognize something about Satan and the access that God gives to him. And I think right there is part of the statement that we need to understand. Satan only gets access to us as far as God allows him to have that access. That's been true of Job. He had to go to God and he had to get permission to put this trial before Job. You see, God is still in control. And not to say that every problem that we have is always instigated by Satan himself. That's not true. But the fact is, any trials that we have are trials that are not beyond God's authority and God's sovereignty and God's control in our life. And so when life seems out of control, we can know with assurance, even from looking at this book of Job, that nothing that we ever experience is something that God hasn't already figured out for us, that God hasn't already planned for us. God doesn't always keep us from trials, but he certainly will help us get through those trials. And he always puts limits to the amount of trial and the amount of problems that we're going to experience. And that is true for us today. But we must also recognize that even though Satan's authority is limited, he is still, as the Bible tells us, actively looking. He's actively, the Bible says, lurking about as a roaring lion, right? Seeking whom he may devour. And we have to be recognizing the fact that the forces of Satan, the forces of darkness are a real foe in the Christian's life. It's not that Satan can possess us or he can overtake us, but the fact is, the Bible tells us the greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. But Satan, nonetheless, is still in the world, and he's still out actively looking to see who he may devour, just as he did with Job. He was walking to and fro amongst the earth. He found Job, and he was ready to attack. But even though sometimes Satan is permitted access, he's never given authority. And God is always our protection in all of these situations. We need to remember some of these principles about Satan, because sometimes we feel overwhelmed. And when we feel overwhelmed, sometimes we feel, well, maybe God's overwhelmed with it too. But we must never allow ourselves to think that our situation is greater than God's concerns for us. So with that, let's look at the second point this morning, and that is, I want us just to really inventory, if you will, just how bad Job's day was. If this isn't a downer, I don't know what will be. But just how bad were Job's great losses? Think about it this way. This all happened again in the course of one day. Job's losses were phenomenal. They were complete. They were sudden. They were really inexplicable. He didn't see any of this coming. He had no reason to explain it. And you see this news of his great losses coming one after another in quick successive reports. No attempt to soften the blow. Job gets hit with, everything that Satan has to give him. one blow after another. The guy's not even done reporting the first problem when the next guy comes running up with the next problem that Job has to deal with. And perhaps the fact that Job had to deal with this all suddenly and all in such quick succession, this may have been part of Satan's plan of attack against Job. Sometimes we get this boom, 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 boom. It's like bad things just start piling up, right? When they use the old phrase, when it rains, it pours, right? Well, this is what happened with Job. It was raining and it was pouring all within a matter of a few minutes of Job's life. Job was taken unawares by this. He wasn't prepared to take care of these types of really bad situations. He was under this pressure of this sudden loss. It really put him to the test in a very short amount of time. How many times do we face tests in our life that come to us in such rapid-fire succession, that come to us with such overwhelming circumstances that will affect us, that what our reaction to sometimes is not always what it should be? That's the whole point. It's always in the greatest instant of time when the bad news happens that we are first thinking about reacting, right? We don't have time to step back and think it through. We don't have time to go back and read my Bible about this. Maybe we don't even have time to pray about it because we say it's all just boom, boom, boom right in front of me. And what we are going to do in that instant of time tells a lot about our character. And of course, it told a lot about Job as well. The character of man is generally revealed in the hour of sudden crisis. It's when crisis comes that our character really comes through. What's in our heart will suddenly break out from us in those times, especially when we're under great anguish or great pain. So let's take a look at a couple of the things that Job suffered and how quickly he dealt with these problems. We saw in verse 15, of course, we're given inventory earlier of all of these animals and that he had under his possession. It says in verse 3, his substance was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household. Now look at verse 15. What does it say? Verse 14, there came a messenger to Job. He said, the oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped to tell thee. The material losses began with his oxen and his asses. He says he had 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses. That's a lot of oxen plowing in the field. This wasn't just, Paul from Little House on the Prairie with his one little yoke of oxen, This was a major operation. I don't know if you think about it in terms of today, but, think about the Midwest. We don't have fields like this when they put these combines out, right? And they have these giant, I guess they're $1 million machines now. I don't know what they cost. And they line them up, right? They're so big they have these GPS, right, to be able to help them through the fields and navigate this vast amounts of crops they have to harvest. And you see them, they're lined up. You see them, on TV sometimes. And you think, man, that's a big operation. That's what you got to think about with Job. He had the ox out in the field. These 500 yoke of oxen, they were out doing their work. A whole host of servants to run these oxen, to plow these fields, to deal with all of this agricultural work. And this great group of Sabaeans came along, and they said, we're taking this from Job. And because I know the servants won't let us just take it, what do? They kill all of the servants that Job had that were dealing with these oxen. That's a lot to think about. I don't know how many men were slaughtered that day, but certainly a lot of servants. And certainly a lot of servants that Job would have known. Maybe some that had worked for him all his life. Some that had been there and, grown up in his house. Job lost not just the ox and the asses. He lost these servants, these trusted field hands that were working for him. Then what does it say to us in verse 16? He says, while he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So now he has a problem with the sheep. Out of the blue, it's not It's not the band of Sabaeans. This is just some kind of natural disaster. Fire of God falls from heaven and burns up the sheep. How many sheep did he have? 7,000 sheep burned up in an instant. I don't know how that happens. I can't explain it. It was obviously some kind of supernatural occurrence. And the servant comes along and he says, the sheep are all gone, they're all dead, they're consumed in fire, and the servants went with them. And so they're all gone. I don't know how many shepherds it takes to care of 7,000 sheep, but it wasn't just a few. Again, he lost not just material possessions, he lost human lives that were precious in God's sight. Then what do we see in verse 17? While he was yet speaking, you notice how this rapid fire goes? He was still speaking. There came another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels, have carried them away, yea, slain the servants with the edge of the sword. I only am escaped alone to tell thee. How many camels did he have? 3,000 camels. They came, and in an instant another group of people came, took away the camels. More stuff, gone. Servants, killed. Losses, devastating. I don't know if we've ever really taken time, because it just happens here in 3 or 4 verses. Do you realize the depth of loss that Job faced in just a short amount of time? It's really an amazing thing. The material losses completely wiped out all of Job's livestock and all but 3 of his hired servants from the field. The only 3 that came back with the reports, right? No doubt many of these had these relationships with Job, but in an instant of time, it's like, you think about the stock market crash, right? The 1920, we weren't living then, but the fact is it was a bad time. 1929, stock market crashed, and there were people who were so devastated by the news that they had lost everything, that in New York City, people were taking their own lives. People were jumping out of buildings, stockbrokers, people who were wealthy one minute and gone, everything was gone the next. They couldn't deal with this type of loss. They would rather take their own life. That was a common occurrence after the stock market crashed. Here is like Job's stock market. It had completely crashed in front of him. He had lost everything in a moment's time. But it doesn't stop there. Let's look at verses 18 and 19. It says in verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So in the midst of hearing about all of his losses of material wealth, all of the losses of the servants that he would have known and been a part of their lives, in the middle of all this, he hears his own flesh and blood, his own sons and daughters, his own family have all been killed. Presumably their families were as well. They were all together there. Now, if you've ever lost a child, if you've ever lost a family member to death, you know how painful it can be. But imagine losing all of them at once. This is what Job was facing. He lost all of his children at the same moment in time. And something about these losses that, you say, well, I don't think you can always wrap our head around it, and I don't think we can. But the fact is, these losses that Job had, they were all devastating, and they were all complete. They were things that he was not going to get back again. You ever think about this? The ones that mattered the most to him, his own children and his own servants, these were permanent and irreversible losses. Sometimes, my kids, they'll get a lollipop, right? For one reason or another. And it seems like without a doubt, if you give them all a lollipop, one of them is going to have it lost in the dirt, right? It's going to fall down on the ground, and they're going to come to you with, I drop my lollipop, and I say, don't eat that, right? You have to tell them, warn them, don't eat the dirt, that's on the, I'll get you another one, right? Don't worry, I can get you another one. Hopefully I have another one that I could give them, but that's the point. A lot, you see somebody, they break something, you say, oh, well, it's okay, we can get you another one. And we kind of teach our kids that, not to, be foolish about these things. But the fact is, things are just things. You can always get more things. But you know what? You can never replace a person. You can never replace somebody who's been lost, somebody who's died. And that's where Job was. I don't know what he was thinking after he said, I lost all my sheep, my camels, and my oxen, and all the rest. Okay, I'll just have to rebuild. But then the guy comes and says, hey, all your sons and daughters are dead too. All of a sudden, you can't replace them. You can't ever get those lives back. This is permanent. This is irreversible. And I think for us, dealing with the story of Job, sometimes we say, well, yeah, it's like sometimes I gain money, sometimes I lose money, sometimes, it's a good day, it's a bad day. But in the end, God's in control. And it's all well and good until something happens to us, until a loss occurs, until a grief happens that we say is permanent, which can never be changed, which can never be brought back to where it was again. Sometimes our losses are like that. They're permanent and they're irreversible. Job's great losses, I don't think we recognize just how difficult they would have been to deal with. Sometimes our losses are difficult for us to deal with as well. But let's turn the corner here and see what Job's response is and see what we can maybe get from Job's response to all of this. We don't, by the way, know how long it took for Job to have all this sink in and settle in. Between the end of verse 19 and the beginning of verse 20, we aren't given a time frame here. I'm sure that there was a time when he was weak in the knees. You ever have somebody say, hey, I've got some bad news, you better sit down? That's because why? You just might, collapse if you hear it. I'm sure if there was a time that Job was going to collapse from the bad news, it was from all of this. So we don't know exactly what time took place, but at some point, Job had processed this enough, and it says in verse 20, Job arose, he rent his mantle, he shaved his head, he fell down upon the ground, and he worshiped. Now, I want us to look at some of Job's response. Job arose, and it says he had rent his mantle and shaved his head. Talked about this in Sunday school this morning. Just in case you need a little refresher, his mantle was his cloak. It was his outer garment, right? And when you rented it, it wasn't like, an Airbnb, like I'm renting it out somebody. It was I was tearing it. They tore their clothes. This was an outward sign. We don't do this today, that I can think of. Maybe the Incredible Hulk's done it a time or two, but the fact is, we don't tend to do this today when you think about it. But in this day and age, in biblical times, this was a common outward expression of great grief, of great emotional distress that Job was under. This was a way in which he would outwardly show his great, deep sorrow. And in the hour of this trial, he got up and he rent his mantle and he shaved his head. Shaving his head was another sense of mourning, another sense of showing an outward appearance of the loss and the great grief and the great sorrow that he was experiencing. But I think it's interesting that Job did these things. He made these outward signs. Obviously, he shows that he wasn't callous to all this news. It wasn't just like, well, who cares? God's in control. You ever see these people that they have that on the outside, and you say, what's really going on the inside? These people that are always like, oh, well, God's in control, and I can be spiritual all the time. I'll give my Sunday school answer. The fact is, trials are designed to hurt. Trials will cause grief. They'll cause sorrow. And this was true for Job as well. Job wanted people to know this was a real deep hurt that he had experienced. And then the interesting thing is he fell down upon the ground and worshiped. And worshiped. He didn't fall down on the ground and cry and wail and pound his fist on the ground. He didn't allow the emotions to overcome his belief in what God is and who he is. He focused on the one thing that would never change and could never be taken from him. That was his faith in God. You ever think about this? You can have everything taken from you. And you go look at some of these places where Christians are persecuted today. And they face jail time for worshiping, or they face, oppression for worshiping. They face all these different challenges just by saying that they're Christians. Do you know what they found? You can throw a Christian in jail, you can take all their belongings, and you can take all their goods and all their things, but they find these Christians, they go to jail, and what do? Just like Paul, I'm singing. I'm worshiping. Because my faith is deeper and can never be taken from me. That's what we are to be as Christians. This is what Job says he could be. There was one thing that could never be taken from him. It was his faith in God. He was going to worship. And so instead of cursing God as Satan said he would do, remember this was the whole point. Satan said, I'm going to do all these things to Job, God, and he's going to curse you. Because he only worships you because of the stuff that you gave him. And Job proves him wrong in this very act. He shows that he worships God because of his deep love for the Lord, because of his deep faith for him. And he recognized that even the terrible things that had happened to him were not the result of blind faith, but were the divine outworkings of providence. The providence of God. So we see Job made the statement publicly that this was affecting him. But he also made the public statement that there's a God that's greater than all this. Verse 21 says, he says this, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You see, Job, in the statement that he makes, he recognizes and publicly declares to those around him that were watching how he might respond to this, by the way, recognize that God was sovereign. God's in control. God is in charge. And that nothing, not even his own family, truly belonged to him. That's what he was acknowledging here. He recognized that everything has always been and always will be in the Lord's hands. You know, a lot of times the Bible talks about us as being stewards of God's possessions, right? When we think about, the money that we get, or the home that we have, or the family that we have, do you know that your family is just there because God's given them to you? The money that you have in the bank is there because God's gifted you with that. And he's entrusted it to you to use for his glory. We have a choice. Do we want to believe it's really ours? Or do we want to believe that it's really the Lord's? Job says, I'm recognizing I'm entitled to nothing. Everything, every last little thing that I've got in life is a blessing from the Lord that he's entrusted me with. And he's allowed to take it away because it never belonged to me in the first place. And that is a mature attitude to have. And so what does it say in verse 22? The sum up is this. In all of this, Job sinned not nor charged God foolishly. The meaning of this last phrase is that Job, he didn't charge God with some moral impropriety. He didn't say, God, this is wrong. God, you didn't do right by me. God, you have no right to take these things from me. How could you be so unloving? or uncaring. He didn't assault God's character. He didn't assault God's nature. And he didn't in any way assault God's sovereignty over the situation. Job recognized God's sovereignty and accepted that which had happened to him as the work of the mysterious providence of God. Just a couple applications from Job's response as we kind of pull this back together. The first is this. When we have a bad day, when things are really as bad as Job for us, when we're feeling the grief and the sorrow, we need to recognize, first of all, it's not unspiritual to mourn our losses. Job took time to mourn. He rent his mantle. He shaved his head. He expressed the great sorrow and grief in a public way. It doesn't ever help us to try to hold this in. It's not unspiritual to say, well, I'm going to just take it like a man, right? And this is the way it is, and I just need to accept it. You know what? Our emotions are real. God created those emotions in us. We need to express them. It's okay to mourn your losses. It's okay to feel things when the bad comes. And the point is how not to live in that state of mourning. To recognize something deeper and greater, and that is this. When we are experiencing a time of loss, a time of sorrow, a time of grief, what are we to do? Just like Job, we are to focus on our faith. To focus on our faith, to worship. That's what he did. It's not the time to pull away from God. It's not the time to distance ourselves from him. It's the time for us to draw close to him, to call upon him, and to recognize he is still worthy of our worship in all things. His worship does not depend on his material blessing in our life. And when we understand that, we've understood the same premise that Job was able to work through this as well. And we also need to make sure, as Job did, that we don't confuse blessing with entitlement. We live in a culture full of entitlement today, don't we? We live in a culture where we expect certain things. There's always a safety net. If I don't, if I'm not able to, make the bill, or I'm not able to do this, or there's somebody somewhere that's going to have a program that can help us. And I'm glad we have programs. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad that we have things to help people. But the fact is, we need to make sure that we don't ever get a sense of I'm entitled to things in life. We have no right to say I deserve to have this kind of car in my parking lot, or I deserve to have this much money in my bank account, or I deserve to have this kind of happiness in my relationships. We don't deserve any of those things. Every good and every perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness nor shadow of turning. In other words, everything that we have a blessing in is a gift from God. And gifts are never things that we're entitled to get. So don't confuse blessing with entitlement. And finally, don't let a bad day make you believe lies and sin against God. Don't let a bad day turn your heart from the Lord, because as was the case with Job, such is the case with us. Satan's not, he doesn't have any new tricks. It's the same old tricks. I'm going to put these problems in your life. I'm going to have all these trials. And you know what? You might not be like Job. You might just turn from him. You might just curse him, because a lot of people would do that. And the fact is, when we have a bad day, we can't allow ourselves to get to that place where we believe the lies that Satan wants us to believe. God is still in control. He's still a loving God, and he's still worthy of our worship. So with all this, I just want to ask you a couple questions, because the whole story, we can't get every detail, but the real question that comes about from this whole story is this. Was Job and this trial that he went through some type of cruel experiment? Was Job like the lab rat in the maze? And God and Satan are up here, well, let's see. Let's put him through the maze and see if he finds the cheese this time. Is that really what Job was about? Was it some kind of cruel experiment? Some people have looked at the book of Job and looked at this story and said, that's exactly what God was doing. He was basically saying, well, go ahead, run him through the maze and see what he can do. Some would say because of this that maybe God's not the loving God he says he is, that he's some kind of cruel God who would use people in this way. But I think that there's something deeper that we touched on last week that I really want us to make sure we recognize, and that is this. An untested faith is an insufficient faith. Let me say that again. An untested faith is an insufficient faith. If you only have faith, if you only believe in the Lord, if you only are thankful to him, or you're only able to worship him on the good days, are you really worshiping him? It's when the bad days come. It's when the trials come and we allow our faith to be tested and we able to go through that trial and recognize, hey, my faith has stood the test. I still have this faith in God. I still want to worship him. I still love him. And no matter what happens, I'm still going to validate before the Lord that he is supreme in my life. That's what it is to be truly a person of faith, someone who truly has placed their faith in God. So while Satan's goal may have been to break Job of his faith, what was God's goal? To build up his faith. Satan may have been trying to break Job, but God was trying to build him up. Job was never told that he was going through this test. He was never given any warning. This was real life for him. And you know what? Real life hits us in the same way. We never get told, oh, by the way, this is just a trial to build your faith. You could make it through. No, the whole point is we don't know. We aren't always given warning. And while not all the trials of life, as we've said, are from Satan, and sometimes we bring our own trials because of our own bad decisions, sometimes even God is chastening us, but do you realize that all trials are supervised by God? He's always in control. He always has our best interest in them, and he wants us ultimately to glorify him through whatever circumstance we have in life. And when we recognize that to be true for us, there's no trial, even the trial of Job, which we cannot leave the situation and say, I might be mourning and I might be grieving and I might have my heart heavy from this, but I can still worship the Lord in it. And that's the amazing faith that God wants each of us to have.